In 2005, Eric Martin was working in a paper mill in Maine, and he had been working at this paper mill for 20 years, and he was reaching up to get something on a shelf when he threw his back out. And in fact, he had slipped a number of discs, and it ultimately meant he was not able to work anymore. He was going to be disabled. And so he's suddenly out of work. His wife, Shelly Martin, was not working at the time, but when he couldn't work, she needed to get a job. And so Shelly, who had not worked in a long time, was able, through some connections, to land a job in her hometown in Maine called Palmyra. Palmyra was a very small rural community. I mean, we're talking maybe 1,200 people that lived there. They also had a 17-year-old daughter named Chelsea who was not eager to go, but it was the only place they could afford, and so they had to go. Luckily, because Palmyra was such a cheap place to live relative to where they had been living, that for less money, they actually ended up getting a bigger piece of property than they had lived in before. It's this beautiful farmhouse that sat on a whole bunch of acreage, but it was incredibly isolated. You had to go down this bumpy access road to get to their long driveway, and then once you were on the property, you'd look out and it was just a full 360 degrees of very dense forest that virtually no one was in. There was no nature trails. It was just dark, dense forest everywhere you looked. So even though no one's that happy about it, they end up moving into this farmhouse, and as they're unpacking their truck, Eric picks up one of his many rifles that he owned. Eric came from a long line of hunters. He loved to hunt. It was his favorite thing to do, and he had a whole bunch of guns that he kept. And as he's carrying the rifle into the house, Shelly says, "Oh no, we're not keeping the guns in the house. You have a barn, you're gonna put your guns in there." This had always been a point of contention for them in their marriage. Shelly just didn't feel safe having guns in the house, especially having kids in there. And so ultimately Eric agrees, okay, fine, I won't put my guns in the house. I'll put them in the barn. And so he went in the barn, and he and his son, Sean, who he had come out to help him, they built this gun case for all of his rifles. It was very heavy duty. They put it in the barn, and then they locked that and then locked the barn itself. So they were totally secure in the barn, but definitely not readily accessible. Over that first year, Shelly and Eric developed this ritual where at the end of the day, they would go out on the front porch of their farmhouse and look out onto the front yard, and they would drink coffee. It was something they both looked forward to, and virtually every night they did this. And so almost exactly a year after moving in, it was in early 2006, Shelly and Eric are sitting on their front porch, enjoying their coffee, they're chatting, and Shelly thinks she sees something in the woods. Now, you have to understand the layout and how far away they are from the woods to get a sense of what they were seeing. Right in front of their porch was a gravel road where they parked their cars. About 20 meters away from their house to the left is their barn, and beyond the barn, basically straight out from the porch, is this huge open field where there's no trees or anything. It was like open grazing area. And then way beyond the field was the beginning of this tree line, of this really dense forest. So we're talking at least a couple hundred meters away where she sees these lights. And she described it as like a pulsating light. It did not look like a car or some sort of vehicle, not to mention there was no road out straight ahead from their porch. It was just a dense forest where there was absolutely no one that should have been in there. Eric immediately, when he sees the lights, he thinks there's a poacher on his property, someone illegally hunting on his property. And so he gets Sean, his son, who did not live with them but was staying the night that night, he gets him to come outside and say, "Hey, do you think that's a poacher down there at the edge of our tree line?" And Sean's like, "I don't know, maybe." Eric decides that he wants to go tell this person to leave his property, and so he asks Sean to come with him. They figured they would just get to the edge of the property and yell out, "Hey, this is private property, you need to leave." As they're walking across the field and they're getting closer to the tree line, the lights, those pulsating lights, begin to fade and disappear back into the woods. And they get all the way up to the tree line and they can't see any lights at all. Even though at this point, standing on the edge of the forest, Eric and Sean are fairly confident that this poacher has left, they decide, just to be sure, let's walk a little ways into the woods. Even though it's totally dark, we're not going to get lost. We'll walk a little ways into the woods and just continue to yell, "This is private property," so they really do leave. And so they begin walking, and it's a very dense forest. Lots of low-hanging limbs. It's not somewhere that's easy to walk. There's no walking trails or anything like that. And they walk, 10, 15 meters into the woods, and then they hear what sounds like someone walking parallel to them, maybe 15 meters away from them on their left. And they both stop and they look. They didn't want to take any chance that they were being stalked by a predator. And so they thought, you know what? The lights are gone. I don't know what animal this is. Let's just get out of here. About a month goes by and Nathan, who is Chelsea's boyfriend, was staying with the family at the farm. And it was the first nice spring day. I mean, it was a very dark and dreary winter. Maine winters tend to be that way. And so that weekend, Nathan and Chelsea decide, let's go walk around the woods. So they take the two family dogs and they start walking across that big field in front of the house into the forest, the same area where Sean and Eric have been looking for those lights and then heard what sounded like an animal that was near them. And so at first, Chelsea has the dogs on leashes, but they get to the forest and she lets them off their leash to let them go run around and go crazy because they've been cooped up because of the wintertime as well. The two dogs instantly take off running for about 100 meters and then they come to a dead stop right outside this big mound. It looks like a dirt mound, but they get up close to it and they can tell that it's actually more like a den. There are these huge pieces of wood that have been leaned into like a lean-to type structure with moss and dirt and grass put all over the outside. I mean, it looks like a very intentionally made mound. And there's a circular hole that's been created right on the front of it. And the dogs have stopped right outside and they're poking their heads in and smelling into this hole. And Nathan and Chelsea are looking at this thinking, who did this? Is this like a hunter's thing? Is this something a hunter might make? Would an animal make this? This seems really big for some animal to make this, but it definitely was made on purpose, whatever it is. And so Nathan, he just kind of looks down into this den, but it's totally dark, and he thinks he hears growling coming from inside of the den. And so without any hesitation, he goes, we gotta go. I don't know what's living in there, but we gotta go. And so they take the dogs, they put them back on leashes, and the two of them get out of the forest as quickly as they can. When Nathan and Chelsea came back to the house, they told Eric and Shelly, and actually Sean was there too, and they said, hey, we found this den of some kind out in the middle of the woods, basically straight out from your front porch. And that's when Eric and Sean said, well, about a month ago, we were out in that same area, and we could have sworn we heard some animal stalking us. A couple of months go by and Eric and Shelly are sitting on their front porch having their coffee ritual, and there was just this low mist that kind of hung over the entire field. And as they're sitting there, they're commenting on how creepy it was. And what started as just kind of a friendly discussion about the general creepiness took a turn when they realized that they couldn't hear any wildlife. No crickets, no animals, no anything. And normally at night, because they were out here all the time, it was humming with life. And so Shelly had this high-powered flashlight that she always had out with her, and she starts scanning the property, not knowing what she's looking for, but it just seemed really odd that they couldn't hear any wildlife. But after she scans across the whole field, she doesn't see anything, and so she puts her flashlight down and just starts talking to Eric about whatever they normally talked about over coffee at night. Eric would say in numerous interviews that for whatever reason, when she put that flashlight down, he suddenly felt like they were in danger. He's looking out, he doesn't see anything, and then all of a sudden he just says, you know what? We gotta go inside. I don't know what it is, but we gotta go inside. And Shelly's like, come on, I wanna stay out here for a little bit longer. We'll go in a few minutes. And Eric stands up and he's like, no, go inside. And he tries to grab her to kind of push her into the house. And she's kind of fighting against him. And then all of a sudden, Shelly stops. And she goes, did you hear that? And Eric immediately knew that whatever it was, it's the reason he had that sudden feeling of being in danger. Eric turns around and he can't see anything because it's too dark. Shelly grabs her flashlight and she begins scanning the tree line. And she gets to the field and gets about halfway across the field right in front of them, and she stops. Because right in the middle of the field are three creatures that look like wolves. These huge creatures that are looking right at them. Two others join them. So there's 5 wolf-like creatures that are staring at them right from the middle of their field. She says to Eric, what are those? And Eric, who's an experienced hunter, he has no idea. He goes, I think they're bears. They could be wolves. We gotta go inside. And so Shelly's just holding the light and they start charging directly at her so fast that she wasn't able to keep the light on them. They were already halfway across the field. They go inside, they shut the door and they lock it. And without saying a word, the two of them make their rounds across the entire bottom floor, lock every window, close every blind, make sure everything is shut. There was something different about these 5 creatures. The way they started running towards them, it just felt like they were targeting Eric and Shelly. And so even after the house had been secured, they didn't feel safe. And so they're standing in the middle of their cabin and Eric's saying, my guns are in the barn. We have no protection. And Shelly is like, whatever you do, do not go out there. We don't know what these are. It could be a bear, it could be a wolf, we don't know. Don't go out there. Shelly goes upstairs, she shuts off all the lights, she makes sure all the windows are shut. And then she goes to Chelsea's room, her daughter, and she wakes her up and she says, hey, come here, you gotta look at this. And they go to the window and they kind of like poke their head into the window because they don't want to like totally open it up and stare out because they don't want the creatures to see them. but they're kind of poking their head out the window, and she's like, look. And standing on the gravel are these 5 creatures that are just standing in a row looking directly at the house. It was like they were waiting for them to come out the front door. They were just patiently standing there looking at the house. It did not look like normal animal behavior at all. And as she's looking, one of the animals looks up at Shelly in the window, and the creature stands on its 2 legs. It gets on its hind legs and looks at her, and Shelly gasps and falls over because the creature's like 8 feet tall. And so Shelly's on the ground looking at Chelsea, and she can't believe what she just saw. It's like her brain can't process that this creature, one, had even seen her. They barely had their head up in the window. But that it stood on its hind legs, that it was so big. What are they doing? Sitting in a row right on the outside of the house waiting for us? What's going on here? And so Shelly tells Chelsea, get in your bed, don't go to your windows, don't leave this room. And that's when Shelly also remembers that she hasn't heard her 2 dogs. And she's worried they might be outside. And so she starts quietly walking all along the top floor looking for her dogs. She's calling to her 2 dogs, and they don't come out. Goes into the master bedroom and finds her 2 dogs hiding in the corner of the room next to each other. Like they're startled by whatever it is outside. Meanwhile, Eric was pacing downstairs thinking he needed to go to the barn and he needed to get his guns to protect the family. But he knew that between his own disability, he can barely walk very fast, and he'd have to unlock the barn, and then he'd have to pull down the gun case, unlock that. All the while, he's exposed to these animals that are out there. And so the next best thing in his mind is maybe he could run outside, get in his truck, and back the truck up to the front door, and then he could get his wife and his daughter to come out, jump in the car, and they could drive away. So he just goes to the window and he pulls the blinds aside to look outside, and those 5 creatures are now gone. They're not sitting on the gravel path right in front of the house. He doesn't know where they are, but they're not in front of the house. And so he closes the blinds and he's like, well, I don't know where they are. It's too dangerous to go out there. He starts pacing some more and he goes back to look, and he sees them back in the field where they first saw them, all 5. You can see all 5. They're facing the house still, but he can see them because the moon has now popped through and he's got illumination on the field, and he can see all 5. And he's like, okay, maybe if I just keep my eye on them, I can open the door, run out, get the car, back it up without them seeing me. And so without telling Shelly, he opens the door and he goes onto the front porch and he sees them out in the field. He's got a good line of sight on them. Quiet as he can, he walks down the steps and he makes his way over to his truck, which is about 10 meters away. And as he's getting closer and closer to his truck, he's got his eye on the creatures that are in the field. They haven't moved. They apparently haven't seen him. He gets to the driver's side of his truck and he's got his keys out and he's kind of fumbling to hit the unlock button, and then his motion sensor light kicks on. And he's so on edge being out there, when the light kicks on, he drops his keys because he's so startled. And the first thing he does, he looks towards the field and he sees that one of the 5 creatures is now standing on its hind legs looking at him directly. Before he even bends down to get his keys, he sees them all running towards him. He reaches down, he grabs his keys, he runs back to the house as fast as he can, and he gets inside and slams it right as he can hear them crossing the gravel right in front of the house. And he hears them bound onto the porch and start running around the wraparound porch. He's too scared to even look in the window, so he ducks down to get out of view. Shelly, who was upstairs, can hear everything going on, and she yells, Eric, what's going on? And he goes, stay up there, stay up there. Shelly, Eric, Chelsea, everyone's just frozen waiting, knowing that these creatures are right on the other side, walking along his wraparound porch. And after a while, he hears the footsteps of these creatures leave the porch and go back onto the gravel area. And at some point, he pokes his head up and he looks, and all 5 are sitting there just facing the house, waiting for them to come out of the house. And so he scurries up the stairs to where Shelly and Chelsea are, and they just are so scared. So they decide they gotta call the police. If nothing else, the police will drive up and their vehicle might scare away these creatures. But on the phone, Shelly lets on that what they're really scared about is something on their property. In fact, it's 5 creatures, things running around outside their property. And immediately the police officer who's responding to this, he's like, all right, well, are you sure it's not a moose? Are you sure it's not a bear? And finally she's like, no, can you please just come over here? And he's like, listen, ma'am, just keep your door shut, keep your windows shut, and I'm sure it'll be fine. And ultimately that's how the call ends. They're on their own. The family felt helpless, and Eric especially felt really frustrated because he can't protect his family. He doesn't have a weapon. He can't get to his vehicle. They're just trapped. And so they decide the only thing we can do is barricade ourselves inside of the house. And so for the next 30 minutes, they put heavy furniture in front of all the doors and the windows. They blocked everything as best as they could. They got kitchen knives and they got an axe that they had inside to chop some wood. As they go upstairs, they lock themselves in the master bedroom with their weapons and their dogs. And they get on the bed and they just decide all we can do is wait until the sun comes up. During the time they were barricading their house, they would look out from time to time and they would see the 5 creatures just sitting on that gravel area right in front of their house, just waiting for them. When they finally went upstairs and barricaded themselves in that room, they immediately heard the creatures move off of the gravel, and they heard a couple of them at least walk onto the porch and start pacing around the porch. And it's totally silent besides the sounds of these creatures. And they were clearly communicating with each other. They were bumping into walls and then they were howling at each other. There was clear communication happening where they were trying to coordinate some sort of attack on the family. Now, the way the house was set up is there was a second floor roof, and then the first floor was a little bit wider than the second floor and had its own kind of separate roof. And after a while, the creatures stopped walking on the porch. They left the porch and it's just silence. And then they would hear them jump onto that first roof. The scary thing about this is that if you walked around the roof, you could actually look into the second floor windows. And so they're laying there and periodically they'd be looking out their window. There was windows on either side of the room they were in, but there was a thin curtain between them and the window. And so from time to time, these creatures would walk past their windows and they would stop, they'd put their paws up onto the window and they would look inside. But there was a very thin sheet between them and the glass, so they couldn't see the creature and the creature couldn't see them. All night, they're listening to these creatures running around. And sometimes they'd hear really loud scratching, like they had figured something out and they were trying to burrow their way into the house. But after a whole night of this, they never actually broke the glass. They never got inside the house. As the sun started to come up in the morning, the creatures jumped off the roof and they could hear them running away. And for about an hour, they didn't hear anything outside. The sun's come up and they felt safe again. And so they left their room, they go downstairs and they finally open it up, and all over their property are signs of huge creatures that had been on their property. Massive footprints with huge claws at the end. They found tufts of hair that had gotten caught on fence posts. And even scarier is they found all these points on the house, in particular on the second floor when they were walking on that roof, where there was clear markings that they had tried to burrow into the house. There were these deep-seated scratch marks into the side of the house. The front door had been scratched apart. I mean, it was very clear that whatever these creatures were, they were trying to get into the house, but they had just been unsuccessful. This experience was so traumatic for the family that they sold the house and they moved very quickly after that, and they have not experienced anything like that since they left. On the night of October 17th, 2019, a 47-year-old woman named Ada Quintal stepped out of her family's cabin in rural Michigan to take her dog for a walk and have a smoke. It was very late. It was about 1:30 in the morning. Now, this cabin where she was staying was very isolated. It was about a half mile away from any neighbors, but Ada actually enjoyed the solitude. You know, she was surrounded on all sides by forest and swamps, and the wilderness actually made Ada feel a lot safer than when she was back home in the densely populated Detroit area where she lived full-time. And this was because just a few months earlier, when she had been back home in Detroit, she had been the victim of an unprovoked attack. She had been out in the city around all these people in broad daylight, and this guy came up to her and just jumped her, broke her nose, gave her a concussion, and then ran off. But the scariest part of this attack was not the fact that she had been brutalized. It was that this guy did not appear to have any reason to attack her. He didn't know Ada, and Ada had not been robbed or anything. It was like he just randomly identified her and attacked her. And the guy had never been caught. And so this ordeal had had such a profound impact on Ada that it really began to affect her health, both mentally and physically. She started to just kind of decline. And on top of that, she had been laid off from her engineering job, and so now she was unemployed and seriously depressed. And so recently, when Ada's uncle had called her and offered to pay her to come out and live in this 2-story family cabin and fix it up for the winter, Ada had jumped at the chance. I mean, not only would this solve her unemployment issue, but also she loved this cabin. It had been in her family for 75 years, and some of her fondest childhood memories were in this cabin. And so she looked at this as a chance to kind of get away from the city and just be in her happy place and kind of reset and recover from the trauma of the attack. And so for the past week, Ada and her boyfriend had been staying in this cabin and doing small repairs and cleaning it up. But 2 days earlier, her boyfriend had to leave and go back to the city where they were actually fixing up another property, a condo. And so now it was just Ada and her dog. But that was totally fine with Ada. She liked being out here by herself, so this was no big deal. But tonight, she was feeling frustrated because she couldn't sleep. About an hour earlier, she had taken a pill to help her sleep, but so far it hadn't worked, and so she was feeling kind of wired and anxious, and so she had decided to go on a walk with her dog in hopes that that would clear her mind and allow her to finally get some rest. Now, these roads that surrounded this cabin were kind of small and zigzaggy, and there weren't any street lights. I mean, this is not exactly a good place to go for a nighttime walk. But Ada knew this place like the back of her hand, and she also carried a 9mm pistol in her pocket, just for protection. And so after walking for a few minutes down one of these dark winding roads, Ada's dog stopped to relieve himself on a bush. So as the dog was going to the bathroom, Ada just casually smoked and waited. But at some point, the dog just stopped going to the bathroom, turned slightly, and began growling, and its ears perked up, and it was looking off into the darkness right ahead of them. And so Ada instinctively took her flashlight and raised it up and aimed it in the direction her dog was looking. And right away, the cone of light illuminated these two eyes looking right back at Ada. And immediately Ada knew what she was staring at. It was a mountain lion. And so doing her best to stay calm, Ada slowly reached into her pocket to pull out her gun, but before pulling it out, the two eyes blinked shut, and then she heard it kind of turn and run off into the forest. It was gone. Once Ada was sure the mountain lion really was gone, she breathed a sigh of relief, and then very quickly tugged on her dog's leash, they turned around, and she hustled back towards the cabin. When Ada reached her cabin, which was all lit up because she had left all the lights on before she had left, she jumped up the front steps, she opened up the door, she went inside with her dog, and after letting her dog off the leash, she shut and locked the door. Then she grabbed her phone and texted her boyfriend to tell him about this mountain lion. And then after hitting send, Ada felt relieved to be back in her cabin, but at the same time, she still felt very on edge. I mean, she had been, just a few feet away from a mountain lion in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere. But as Ada was doing her best to calm herself down, she heard this noise coming from outside the living room window, almost like twig snapping, like somebody was walking past the window. And so the way this cabin was set up is when you first walked inside, you were in the kitchen, and then the back half of the cabin was a living room, and then there were also stairs leading up to a second floor. But from in the kitchen, you had a clear line of sight into the living room, and vice versa. It was kind of like one big room with two functions. And so from where Ada was standing in the kitchen, she could clearly see the window in the living room where this noise had kind of come through, but because the inside of the cabin was all lit up and the outside was dark, from her perspective, all she could see was a reflection on that window. So to look outside that window to see what had made that noise, she would need to get right up next to the window. And so feeling pretty nervous at this point, she walked across the cabin, she made her way towards this window, and then she pressed her face right up against the glass to look outside. But all she saw outside was just darkness. I mean, there was nothing out there. And so Ada stepped back from the window and started to wonder if maybe the sound she had just heard was maybe that mountain lion. Maybe it followed her back here. That was terrifying, but at least she was inside. But also she was thinking to herself, mountain lions are not known for being aggressive towards humans, and they wouldn't come up to her cabin like this and prowl around outside. That's just not what mountain lions do. But Ada didn't really have any other explanation, and so she told herself, it's gotta be nothing, there's nothing out there, this is a safe place. And so she kind of forgot about the noise, and she took off her coat and put her stuff down, and then she sat down on the couch in the living room, turned on the TV, and tried to relax. But only about 20 minutes later, when Ada had finally relaxed and was even thinking about getting into her bed and going to sleep, she heard another noise coming from that same window in the living room. And this time, when she looked up and looked out that window, despite the reflections inside the cabin, she could clearly tell there was something moving outside of her cabin. And it was definitely not a mountain lion. It looked like a man. And so Ada had to stifle a scream, and then instinctively she lunged for her gun on the coffee table, and then darted behind the couch and crouched down to make sure whoever was out there couldn't see her. And then, with gun in hand, she began calling out to the person out there that, "Hey, I'm armed. If you come in here, I'm going to shoot you." But it was just silence. And then Ada strained her ears to try to hear any sound that would give away where this person went. Were they still outside that window? Had they moved somewhere else? But all she could hear was the sound of the wind whipping outside and an owl hooting off in the distance. But then, right as Ada was starting to wonder, did I really see somebody out there? Is this all in my head? That's when she heard the distinct sound of footsteps on her front porch. And so again, Ada had to stifle a scream, and she darted to the other side of the couch, preventing the person from the front of the house to seeing her now. Then she grabbed her phone and she was dialing 911, and she was about to hit call when she stopped herself. And she began to wonder, am I just totally overreacting here? I don't know if there's somebody out there. I could be hearing things. Or maybe it's just like an animal or something.
And also, deep down, Ada knew that ever since that attack in Detroit that summer, that basically everything scared her. And she was starting to wonder if maybe she was just being totally paranoid and there was nothing going on. And she didn't want to embarrass herself by calling 911 and having them come out here and finding nothing. And so Ada decided she would call her boyfriend, and so she called her boyfriend, and as the phone is ringing, she's listening intently for any other footsteps outside, but she can't hear anything. And then her boyfriend, he didn't pick up. It's also like 2:30 in the morning at this point, but her boyfriend doesn't answer. And so after that, she tries calling one of her friends, and her friend does pick up. And right away, Ada just began telling this friend about all the things that had happened that night, from going out and seeing the mountain lion, and then coming back in, hearing the sound, and now hearing the footsteps on the front porch. And, she was worried that maybe she was just making it all up, but she was still really scared. And even though Ada was trying to be composed as she was telling her friend, her voice began to crack and she began to cry because she really was scared. And the friend just said, "Look, I'm going to call the police on your behalf. It seems like it's worth having them come out just to make sure you're really okay. Give me the address and I'll tell them where to go." And so Ada would give her friend the address, but she told the friend, "Thank you, but do not call right now. Just please stay on the phone for a minute and let me just do a quick investigation. Let me look out the windows, and just really make sure that this is nothing before you call the police." And so the friend said, "Okay, look around, but then I'm calling the police." And so with her phone and her gun in hand, Ada very carefully crept out from behind the couch, keeping a low profile, staying below the sight line of all the windows. And she crept from the living room into the kitchen towards the front of the house, and she walked over to the sink, and she very slowly raised her head until she could just barely peek through the window right above the sink that overlooked the front porch. Because remember, that was the last place she had heard sounds, from the front porch. And so she very carefully peeks and looks out the window, and there's nothing there. Nobody's on the porch. It's just empty, dark forest. She's safe. Ada let out a relieved half cry, half laugh, and then stood all the way up and felt totally ridiculous because clearly she had just imagined, all these people wandering around the outside of her house. And so she was about to tell her friend that, "Hey, sorry, there is no issue here. Don't call the police." But before she could get the words out, Ada happened to turn around and was looking back towards the living room, and she froze. Because there, in that same window she had heard those sounds coming from in the living room, was now the silhouettes of two men, clear as day, just looking in the window right at Ada. And so, acting purely on instinct, Ada just raised her gun and aimed it at these two men, and to her horror, the two men also raised guns and aimed them right back at Ada. And so Ada just started firing her gun at the window, and these men began shooting back at her, and right before Ada leapt to the ground, she was pretty sure she hit one of the men in the head with one of her rounds, and so she lands on the ground. It's absolute pandemonium at this point, and her friend, who's still on the phone, is screaming like, "What's going on? What's going on?" And all Ada could think to do was yell out, "There's two men, they're shooting at me, I think I shot one of them." And the friend is screaming, "I'm gonna call the police." And then the line goes dead, and Ada, who's crouched down behind the kitchen island at this point, she realizes all the shooting has stopped. It's now dead silent in the cabin. And so for a second, Ada was thinking to herself, maybe I managed to shoot both of them, and that's why it's quiet right now. But then another thought began to enter her head, that maybe she had only shot one of them, and the other survivor was moving into position to maybe ambush her. And so as she's running through what she's gonna do, she hears this horrible, loud thumping sound right above her in the second floor of the cabin. Now, Ada knew at this moment she should just get her dog and run. Because if this second shooter has survived and has now come into her cabin and is upstairs, that means the forest is now clear and she can make a run for it. But as she sat there by the island, still clutching her gun, in this beloved family cabin of hers, she began thinking about the fact that ever since that attack in Detroit over the summer, that had totally wrecked her life and made her scared of everything. And so as she heard the sound of whoever this was marching around in her second floor, she made a decision. She was going to stand her ground and fight. And so she took a deep breath, she stood up, and with gun in hand, she made her way to the stairs and began to go up. The police arrived at the cabin about 30 minutes later because Ada's friend did call the police, and she warned them that as far as she knew, there could be at least 2 gunmen there, and maybe Ada had shot one of them, she wasn't sure. And so when the police arrived, they showed up, guns drawn, and they walked up to the cabin and they searched the outside, but there was nobody out there, it was silent. And then when they made entry into the cabin, they saw clearly there had been a shootout. I mean, there were bullet holes all over the place, broken windows, but after searching the cabin top to bottom, they didn't find anybody. No Ada, no shooters. However, they did find Ada's terrified dog inside of the cabin, and the dog would be just fine. Now, once the cabin was secured of any threats, the police would do another comprehensive search looking for any evidence that would kind of tell them, where Ada or these shooters had gone. And during this secondary search, they would find Ada's shoes and her cell phone on the roof of the cabin, and they would also find her gun on the ground not far from the roof, suggesting maybe she had fallen off the roof or jumped from the roof, but they were kind of located roughly in the same area. And during this secondary search, they wouldn't find Ada or the gunman, but they would find Ada's cell phone and her shoes on the roof of the cabin, and they would also find Ada's gun on the ground not far from where her shoes and cell phone had been found. But that was it. Police immediately launched a massive search in the forest surrounding the cabin, but despite looking all over the place, they could not find any signs of Ada or her attackers. Police checked local hospitals to see if maybe the man that Ada had shot had shown up seeking medical attention, but as far as they could tell, he hadn't. And so pretty quickly, the police theorized that maybe there were no gunmen. Maybe what really happened here is Ada's boyfriend attacked her, and he was responsible for whatever happened to her. But when police checked on Ada's boyfriend, it would turn out he had a rock-solid alibi. He had been with Ada's adult son at the time Ada had gone missing, and Ada's own son said, yes, for sure, he was with me. He did not do this. But after that, the police thought, okay, well, maybe if Ada's boyfriend didn't do this, maybe he hired other people to hurt Ada. But there was no evidence of any strange financial transactions, and as far as they could tell when they did some digging, there was no strife in Ada and her boyfriend's relationship. So there was no clear reason why he would want to hurt her. And so that lead also kind of fell flat. Police would confirm that Ada was attacked that previous summer by this random guy in Detroit, and so for a little while they speculated that, maybe this guy, this attacker, who had never been caught, had maybe tracked Ada down to finish off the job. But that seemed so far-fetched and just unlikely that basically was shut down as well. And as the days passed, the evidence that was coming in only made the case more confusing. For example, there were all these bullets fired during this big shootout in the cabin, and when they examined the actual bullets they extracted from the walls and the floor and the ceiling, they were all from Ada's gun. However, outside and inside the cabin, they found all these different shell casings, suggesting that those bullets had been fired from different weapons, i.e., maybe the attacker's weapons. And so as the weeks passed by and Ada and her attackers were not found, people began to speculate that, maybe this was all an elaborate setup by Ada just so she could disappear. Or other people thought maybe she was abducted by aliens. There were lots of theories surrounding this, but basically nobody knew what happened. And then pretty soon, the case just went completely cold. That is, until December 21st, 2019, so about 2 months after Ada's disappearance. And on that day, Ada's family decided to drain a pond that was near that cabin in the woods. At this point, the family was so desperate for closure that they were prepared to do just about anything to find Ada and to figure out what happened to her. And so even though this pond had previously been searched by the police, they drained this pond, and sure enough, they find Ada. She was deceased, and her body was found about 300 yards away from the cabin, and she was covered in only about a foot of water. Now, initially, the speculation was, well, here you go. She must have been chased out of her cabin by these attackers, and she was shot and killed, and this is where she fell. But after a quick examination of her body, it was clear she had no bullet wounds on her anywhere. In fact, she didn't even have any bruises on her or any major scrapes or cuts or anything, so it didn't even seem like she had been in any sort of physical struggle at all before she died. In fact, unless she had drowned, it really just seemed totally unclear how she had died. It was not until the medical examiner did Ada's autopsy that all this baffling evidence began to make sense. It would turn out, in the wake of that horrible random attack that Ada had suffered over the summer, that Ada was actually doing far worse than she let on to her family and friends. She had basically begun to cope with her trauma and anxiety with substance abuse. And so on the night that she had died, she was likely feeling totally stressed out and anxious, and she couldn't sleep as a result. And so she had taken some Valium, which is a fairly strong sedative, and also some anti-anxiety medication, but after taking those pills, she still wasn't tired. And so that was when she decided to, go out for a walk with her dog, to clear her head, and have a smoke. But it was not cigarettes that she was smoking. She was smoking methamphetamine, known simply as meth. And meth is a very strong stimulant that people like because it makes them feel very strong and confident and alert, which for Ada was a powerful antidote to the helplessness she was feeling all the time from the attack she had suffered that summer. But one of the many downsides of meth is that it can make you extremely paranoid. And so during her walk that night, as she's smoking meth, she sees a mountain lion, which terrifies her. And then after the mountain lion trots off, it was like that jolt of adrenaline and fear from seeing the mountain lion didn't subside because of smoking meth. It was like the meth sent her into this paranoia overdrive that she couldn't escape from. And so when Ada went back inside of her cabin, she very likely did see people in her windows. But almost certainly it was just her own reflection. But again, she's in this meth-induced paranoid state. And so instead of realizing it was her own reflection, she thought it was like intruders coming to get her. And before long, she'd raised her gun and thought the people outside were raising their gun back at her. But again, it's just her reflection. And so when she was shooting, she was basically having a shootout with herself. And then as for, the strange noises she was hearing, like the footsteps on the second floor, very likely those were just natural sounds kind of happening outside. She's out in the middle of a forest. There's lots of noises that are totally natural at night. But again, she's in this paranoid state, and so she went upstairs to confront the person, and then didn't see anybody, and then police theorized that she must have, climbed out onto the roof to hide from these attackers, and then at some point, for reasons unknown, she leapt from the roof or climbed down or something, leaving behind her cell phone and shoes on the roof. She left her gun on the ground, and then she ran off into the forest, where she ultimately collapsed, 300 yards away in a foot of water, where she died not from drowning, but from a combination of hypothermia and also a toxic combination of drugs in her system. And so in the end, the danger that Ada was trying to escape was in her own mind.
In early July of 1953, Mr. and Mrs. Huggin, along with their 3 young daughters, left their home in Winnipeg, Canada for a 6-week summer vacation. They were headed to the girls' grandparents' summer cabin in Wade, Ontario, which is one of the more remote and wild sections of Ontario. Their cabin was right in the middle of this huge swampy forest, and they were not too far from one of the biggest lakes in Ontario called Fox Lake. The family arrived late on July 4th, so they didn't do anything when they arrived. They just hung out at the cabin. And then early the next day, all the adults decided they wanted to take the girls to Fox Lake for the day. So they began gathering all the supplies they would need while the 3 girls played outside the cabin. Now, there's no neighbors or anybody else anywhere near this cabin. And so it was totally normal to have the girls just play outside. They were not concerned about, them getting taken or something. And so the 2 older girls played in the front yard of the cabin, and Geraldine, the 5-year-old, was playing on the side of the cabin. So the 2 girls in front couldn't see Geraldine, and the adults, they were keeping their eye on all 3 girls, but they were mostly just kind of going in and out of the cabin, getting their stuff together, periodically poking their head out, but the girls were fine. At 10 a.m. that morning, the parents had finally packed up the car, and they were ready to collect the girls to head over to the lake. And so they went outside, they got the 2 girls that were out front, and they went to the side of the house, and they couldn't find Geraldine. Now, they weren't worried because where could she have gone? And so they walked around the house, they're yelling for Geraldine, and they asked the 2 girls, have you seen Geraldine? Where'd she go? And they're like, oh, we don't know. She was just over on the side of the house a minute ago. And so they can't find her outside. And so they go in the cabin thinking she must have gone in there because that's the only place she could be. But after thoroughly looking through the cabin and not finding her, they started to get a little bit more worried. At this point, the adults start talking to each other and they're saying, did anybody see Geraldine in the past couple of minutes? Has anybody seen her? And they all said, yeah, I poked my head out the window and I saw her within the past 10 minutes right on the side of the cabin. And so they all agreed within the past 10 minutes, they had seen her right outside the cabin. So they're alarmed they can't find her, but they're thinking we're gonna find her. So they go back outside and they're looking around and they're yelling for her. Now, this is such a remote section of Ontario that there's really no noise pollution and sound travels really, really well. And so when they were yelling her name, it was booming through the woods. And even if Geraldine had, sprinted for 10 minutes away from the cabin, she still easily would have been within earshot. And all she had to do was just, yell back and they would see her. But she didn't yell back, and there was no sign of her anywhere. And so at this point, the family is panicking, and so they call the police. The police show up, and they're looking around thinking, we're not going to be able to search this very effectively on our own. This is a huge, wild, remote section of Canada. And so they called in some professional trackers that were familiar with this area to come in and help them with their search. They also called the army in Winnipeg to send over some people to assist as well. But as soon as the search started, the skies opened up and dumped rain all over the entire area, basically washing away any footprints that they could have used to potentially find her. As the day wore on and the sun was starting to set and there was still no sign of Geraldine, her father said something to the searchers that was intended to help them find his daughter, but it was just this incredibly heartbreaking comment. And what he told them was his daughter was afraid of the dark, and that once it got dark out in the woods here, she's just going to sit down and cry. And so that will stop her from moving farther away from us, hopefully, and we should be able to find her. But they didn't. And for 3 days, they looked everywhere for her, and there was no trace of her. And to make matters even worse is the weather had been really rainy and cold, not below freezing temperatures, but close, like in the 40-degree Fahrenheit range. And she just had a light shirt and shorts on. She was not prepared for the weather. On the evening of the third day, they found footprints that they believed to be Geraldine's high up on this ledge in some moss overlooking Fox Lake. And the footprints indicated that this child, which was probably Geraldine, was looking out over the lake and then turned around and walked away from the ledge down into the swamp where her footprints dissipate. And so the search effort was pushed to this swamp, and they had thousands of people that are combing through this mosquito-infested bush to look for this girl, and once again, there's nothing. Then on the 7th day of the search, they find another set of footprints in the swamp around the area where they were looking for Geraldine. But it wasn't Geraldine's footprints because they were these huge prints that if it was a human print, they would need to be an enormous human being. Or these prints belonged to some enormous animal, but they were unable to determine what animal it was. At this point, although there's not really any real evidence connecting that print to Geraldine, people are starting to suspect that whoever left this print or whatever left this print has something to do with whatever happened to Geraldine. 2 days later, so 9 days after Geraldine has gone missing, some of the professional trackers were 2.5 miles away from where that large print was found in that swamp and where Geraldine's footprints were found up on that ledge. They found a piece of her plaid shirt 2.5 miles away on the eastern shore of another lake called Long Lake. And so they pushed the search effort over to that section of Long Lake, and within 24 hours, they would find Geraldine's remains. The scene where Geraldine was found was bizarre. There was very little left of Geraldine, and from what was left, it was clear there had been significant animal predation. And so initial thoughts were, she must have been attacked by wolves. That's what killed her. But upon closer inspection, they saw that her clothing had not been torn and there was no blood on her clothes. So the animal predation had most likely occurred after she was deceased because they would have been able to pick around the clothing. Whereas if it had been a wolf attack, they would have cut right through the clothes and there would be marks that obviously, she was attacked by animals. But Geraldine's remains appeared to have been dragged out of a nearby meadow to where she was ultimately located. And so they followed the drag line into this meadow and it led them to this opening where all the grass had been matted down. And investigators said it looked like something big had been laying there. And they speculated that that might have been the area where Geraldine had been killed, and then afterwards animals had dragged her over to where she was found. And so investigators are like, well, we found that large footprint in the swamp on the 7th day in the same area where we had found Geraldine's footprints, and we thought they might be connected. And now we're finding a large, what appears to be body print in this meadow that's right near where Geraldine's remains have been found. And so probably whoever or whatever left that print in the swamp is the same one that left this print here in the meadow and therefore is probably Geraldine's killer. But this left investigators with two theories that didn't really make any sense. The first one was, okay, these prints, the swamp print and this body print, belong to an enormous person, like a giant, who ran up to the cabin and abducted Geraldine and ran off and no one saw them or heard them. And for weeks, they've managed to totally evade capture despite being, again, an enormous person lumbering through the forest. So that seemed really unlikely. One, that this giant person even existed, and two, that if this giant person existed, how could they not get caught? They're so big running through the forest, they would be easy to spot. But if you rule out the enormous person theory, you're left with the enormous predator theory, which does make more sense on the surface because there are enormous predators that have attacked humans, so that does happen. But when they looked at her remains, they ruled out a wolf attack, and really, they ruled out animal attacks. But if this is an enormous predator, how did it kill Geraldine? The family was told that unfortunately, because there wasn't enough left of her, they weren't able to determine a cause of death. And so their best guess is she was probably mauled by wild animals, but they would even level with the family and say, honestly, we don't know what did this. One evening in September of 1885, a young woman named Mary stepped out of the backseat of a carriage onto a dirt road in rural England. She had traveled 100 miles from London to the countryside because her husband's aunt had invited her to come visit. Standing on the dirt road, Mary looked up at the big country house. Then she grabbed her suitcase and walked up to the front door and knocked. Then, a moment later, the aunt's maid opened the door. She greeted Mary and took her suitcase and brought the suitcase to the guest room, while Mary headed straight down the hallway to her aunt's bedroom. When she got there, Mary gently knocked on the door and then opened it up. And when she looked inside, she saw the aunt lying in bed, and the aunt looked up and saw Mary and she smiled, but she was very old and very frail, not doing too well physically. And that's part of the reason Mary was here, to just kind of see her while she still could. But the aunt looked up and saw Mary and recognized her, and so she smiled, and Mary came in and sat down next to her, and for a couple of minutes, the two women just had some small talk. Mary talked about her journey from London to, the countryside where she was now, and, the aunt talked about what she was up to. It was all just kind of, pleasantries. But at some point, the aunt kind of stopped and looked up at Mary, and she had this obvious look of pity on her face. And Mary immediately picked up on it, and she's kind of looking back at the aunt, wondering what's going on here. And then the aunt just says to Mary, "Really, how are you holding up?" And immediately, Mary, when she heard this, she felt this knot in her throat, and she had to fight back tears. I mean, she knew exactly what the aunt was talking about. So even though Mary was a young woman, she was already a widow. Her husband had died in an accident about 2 years earlier, and it had sent Mary into this spiraling deep depression. I mean, she was still completely grieving the loss of her husband. He had been the love of her life. And, her extended family and her husband's extended family were all well aware of how badly Mary had been doing. And so they had been extending her invitations constantly to come visit and basically just not be alone. I mean, that was the reason really why her husband's aunt had invited her here, is because she knew Mary likely wasn't doing well. Now, to Mary, this was nice in a way. I mean, she felt very comforted by the family members, and it did seem like people genuinely cared about her. But at the same time, she started to get the impression from basically everybody in her and her husband's family that they kind of expected her to, grieve this loss, but ultimately move on. Like, find somebody else, basically. You're young, like, get remarried, start a new life. But to Mary, she just wanted to be like, no, I'm never gonna find anyone like my husband. He was the love of my life, and no one will ever match him, ever. Like, I'm done. I probably will never get married again. Like, he was it for me. And so, at that moment, Mary really just wanted to end this conversation with her husband's aunt. Like, she didn't want to get into how she was feeling about her husband because it was bad. She felt bad. But instead of saying that to her husband's aunt, she just said, "You know what? I'm okay. I'm just totally exhausted from travel, and I'm gonna go to bed." The aunt nodded and told Mary that, we'll have plenty of time to visit tomorrow, so go get some sleep. And so the two women hugged. And then Mary got up, she left the bedroom, headed to the guest room, she found her suitcase, got on some pajamas, and then crawled into bed. But a few hours later, in the middle of the night, Mary suddenly bolted upright in her bed. She was sweating, she was shaking, she was totally disoriented. It took her a few minutes to even remember where she was. But then finally, when she did and she realized she was safe, she realized she had just had this awful, visceral nightmare that she really couldn't even make sense of. In this nightmare, she was looking out at this huge open field. It's nighttime, and there's nothing but this field. But off in the distance, there was this broken down small shed. It was just sitting there conspicuously right in the middle of this field. And even though Mary was terrified of the shed, she felt this overwhelming urge to go to the shed and investigate. And so it's like with every step as she walked through this field closer and closer to the shed, her fear was rising. And then finally, when she got close to the shed, she began to hear what sounded like somebody moaning inside of the structure. And so now she's really scared, but she keeps walking towards the shed. And then she's right outside. She can't see into the shed, but she can hear the moaning. And she sees her hand just come down and fling the door open, almost like she didn't want to, but her body's acting on autopilot. And then she looks into the shed, and there's this figure tucked into the corner, kind of in the shadows. And it's the thing making these moaning sounds. And it turns, and Mary sees it's this woman, this emaciated, destroyed-looking woman, but her face is the same face as Mary's dead husband. And as soon as she saw that, it jolted her awake. And so that's where she was, sitting in her bedroom, trying to make sense of what she had just seen. And so after 15 or 20 minutes of Mary trying and failing to fall back asleep because of this horrible nightmare, Mary finally says, you know what, I'm just gonna go outside, clear my head, go for a walk. I know it's the middle of the night, whatever. I'll bring some brandy along and sip that to calm my nerves and just kind of walk around until I'm calm, and then I'll go back to sleep. So she hopped out of bed, she grabbed her flask of brandy, grabbed her jacket, got her shoes on, and walked out the front door. About 15 minutes later, Mary was walking up a hill with the moonlight casting down on her. She was sipping her brandy as she went and was already beginning to calm down. Now, Mary was used to living in the city, in London, and so being out here in the countryside was so different. It was so beautiful and peaceful and spaced out that she had kind of just begun walking and not stopped. I mean, she originally thought she would just stay on the aunt's property, but already she was well beyond the property lines and was basically just out exploring in the middle of the night, and she was having a nice time. And so up the hill Mary goes. Now, remember, Mary has never been to this area. This is basically an all-new place. She has no idea what's over here. And she goes up this hill, she crests the top, and she gets a look at what's up there for the first time. And when she sees what's up there, she freezes. She's looking out at this huge field, basically in all directions. And in the center of this field, maybe a couple hundred yards away, is a single small structure, a broken down wooden shed that looks nearly identical to the shed she had just seen in her nightmare. And as soon as she saw that, she's terrified because she knows it's the same one or it's eerily similar. But worse than that, when she saw it, despite her own fears and trepidations about being up here, she felt herself moving towards the shed. It was like her body went into autopilot the same way it did in her dream. It was like she had to go to the shed, even though everything inside of her logically is saying, don't go. But into the field she goes. She deviates off the path and just starts walking towards the shed. Her heart is beating like mad. And as she's getting closer and closer, she even begins to hear moaning sounds coming from the shed. It's like she's living out the nightmare in real life. She can't make sense of it. She wants to go back the other way, but she can't stop herself. She's just going towards the shed. And then finally she reaches the shed, and now for sure she can hear moaning coming from in this building. And she sees her hand reach down and she flings open the shed and she looks in, and sure enough, there is this dark figure tucked in the corner, clearly moaning, like this is her nightmare in real life. But when the person inside the shed turned to look at Mary, it was a woman, but they didn't have her dead husband's face. Instead, it was a woman who practically looked like she was dead or close to death. She obviously needed help. Now, at this point, Mary was kind of relieved. I mean, this whole situation is terrifying, but she was expecting to, somehow see her dead husband's face on this person in the shed. And so when it wasn't, and it was just like a normal person, albeit in a very strange set of circumstances, it was a relief. But now Mary didn't know what to do. It's like she's standing there looking at this woman, having no idea what to do. She doesn't understand how she could have dreamed this and now basically lived it too. Like nothing's adding up. But again, it was like her body continued to operate in this autopilot mode. She suddenly had this really intense desire to go into the shed and help this woman. She didn't know who she was. This is a total stranger in the middle of a field in a shed who's moaning and looks terrible. She has no idea what's going on. But in she goes, and she sits down next to this woman who's now kind of eyeing Mary, like, what are you doing in here with me? And Mary says to her, like, hey, what's going on? How'd you get here? What's wrong? Like, what's happening? But the woman, it was clear she wanted to respond to Mary and, tell her what was going on, but, she was too weak. It was like she really was on death's door here. And Mary could clearly see that. Like, she didn't need to be told this woman is in a very bad way here. Now, Mary knew what needed to happen is this woman needs to get to a hospital. But they were nowhere near a hospital, and this woman clearly can't get up and walk. And Mary's thinking, I'm not strong enough to carry this woman to the hospital. Like, what am I gonna do? And, Mary's thinking, maybe if I just run and get help and they can come back here. But she's looking at this woman thinking, I don't know if she'll survive. She's probably gonna die soon. Like, this is gonna happen now. And so Mary, again, sort of in this weird autopilot mode, decides, you know what? I'm gonna stay right here with this woman. She can't even talk. She can't tell me what's going on, but I am gonna be here with her. I'm gonna be present with her. And if she dies, I'll be here to support her. And so Mary just made herself comfortable. She took her jacket off. She put it over this woman. And then she began letting this woman sip from her brandy flask to, maybe kind of ease the pain. And all night, the two women just kind of sat there and laid together. When the sun finally rose the next morning, Mary looked over at the woman and saw she was still alive. And in fact, if anything, she seemed like her condition had maybe improved slightly. She seemed maybe a little bit more comfortable. Maybe that was from all the brandy. Who knows? But the woman seemed like she had stabilized a little bit. Still couldn't talk or really tell Mary anything, but she seemed to be doing a little bit better. And so Mary's thinking, okay, the sun's up now. Now I can run out, get help, and get this woman the care that she needs. But before Mary could even do that, she began hearing a stomping sound somewhere outside of the shed. And she realized it was a horse approaching. And so Mary, she bolts out of the shed and she looks over towards the road, and there's a horse pulling a covered wagon going right by, and Mary screams and yells and says she needs help. And a man pops his head out of the wagon and says what's going on, and Mary runs over to him and explains this weird situation, how there's this strange woman over here and she's clearly dying, she needs our help. And the man agreed to help. And so he went with Mary to the shed, he picked the woman up, he put her inside of his wagon, and then the three of them together in this wagon drove to Mary's husband's aunt's house. When they got there, the man carried the strange woman inside of the aunt's house, and then Mary told the aunt's maid to go call for the town doctor, and so she said she would. And so at this point, Mary was actually completely relieved. This was kind of a wild, very unexpected night. She doesn't even know who this woman is, but she's definitely happy that she's getting, some level of care here. But Mary sort of felt like her role in this was kind of diminished now. She's gotten the woman here and she's feeling so tired and weak from being up all night. And so Mary decided she would just take a nap. She had been up all night with this woman. She was exhausted. So into her bedroom she went, she climbed into bed, but as she's laying there, she realized she wasn't just tired. She actually felt kind of sick, like ill. And over the next few hours, as she kind of tossed and turned in her bed, not really able to sleep, she would develop this horrible fever. And this fever would just get worse and worse and worse, and Mary would become bedridden, dealing with this mystery illness for weeks, just drifting in and out of consciousness the whole time. It was October by the time Mary's fever finally broke. And on the day that it did, when Mary opened her eyes in this bed, she was clear-headed for the first time. Really, it had been a very rough stretch of a few weeks. And so she's looking around the room, kind of taking stock of her environment, and she sees there's this strange person sitting in a chair in the corner. And her immediate reaction is, oh, this must be like a nurse or a doctor or somebody here that's kind of overseeing me. Mary was aware she had been very sick for several weeks and there were people in and out of the room. But she looked back at this person and realized she actually knew who it was. It was the woman she had rescued from the shed on the night she got sick. It was that woman. But now she wasn't sickly and, dying. The woman looked completely healthy and happy, and she was smiling ear to ear at Mary. Like, this didn't make any sense. Like, what's going on here? And also, Mary just couldn't help but think, like, wait a minute, why is this woman still here? It has been weeks since I rescued her from the shed. Why is she still here? Like, nothing's adding up. But before Mary could ask any questions, this woman, who clearly was super excited to see that Mary was now fully awake and attentive, this woman just starts talking a mile a minute, like she had been waiting to dump all this information on Mary as soon as she was well. Like, clearly this woman has been waiting diligently for her chance to tell her story. And the story that she dumped on Mary at her first chance, like this day, was incredible. The woman told her that a couple of years earlier, she had boarded the ship in England that was bound for Brazil. But about 5 days into their journey, while they're out on the open sea, the ship caught fire. It was this horrible fire. Everyone's trying to evacuate. And this woman said she was in her bedroom, asleep. She didn't even know what was happening. And while she's laying there and the ship is catching fire and beginning to sink, this stranger comes barreling into the room, literally wakes her up, scoops her up, and takes her to the top deck and gets her into a lifeboat right as the ship sinks. This stranger completely saved this woman's life. And so this woman, the stranger who had saved her, and a handful of other lucky people who had made it onto this lifeboat, just began rowing in a single direction, hoping they'd find land. And luckily they did. They found this deserted island. And so they landed there, and for a year, this woman and the stranger and those few people subsisted on this island, barely clinging to life, praying for rescue. And amazingly, after a year of being shipwrecked, they flagged down a ship that did rescue them and brought them to England. However, when they actually got to England, things weren't that good. The stranger who had saved this woman had basically lost his mind from living on this island, not expecting to be rescued. Even though they got rescued, it was like he wasn't coherent anymore. He had lost it. Not to mention he was really ill from the way they were living on this island, scavenging things that weren't necessarily edible, but just to survive, they were eating whatever they could. I mean, it was a very rough lifestyle. And this man, he just hadn't really handled it well. And so he got thrown in a hospital and placed in a particular ward for people that were mentally unwell, and he was basically forgotten about. However, the woman would tell Mary that, when this happened, she felt awful because she felt like this stranger had saved her life and she kind of owed him a debt. And so she decided it would be her mission to find the stranger's family and let them know where he was. And so the woman said she did some research and she figured out where one of his relatives lived. It was really far away on the other side of England. And so she spent all her money, using every vehicle she possibly could, every ride she could take, getting as close to this location as she possibly could. And then when she ran out of money, she just kept on walking towards this destination. And she kept going until she literally ran out of food and water, but she wasn't quite there yet. She knew she was getting close, and she's just walking, and she's basically falling apart, so hell-bent on finding this family member for this stranger, but she can't quite make it. She can't quite get to the family member's house. And that's when she finds this shed out in the middle of the field where she just collapses, thinking, okay, this is where I'm gonna die. And so back in the guest room, Mary is listening to this woman tell this unbelievable story, and at some point the woman just kind of stops when she gets to the shed scene. And Mary's looking at her like, I don't really understand where you're going with this. I don't understand why you're here telling me this. And the woman, she just starts to laugh, like this joyous laughter, just nonstop laughter. And then she goes, don't you get it? And then seconds later, Mary hears footsteps, and a man walks into the bedroom. And it's Mary's husband. He was the stranger who rescued that woman. He didn't die in an accident 2 years ago like they thought. He was in a shipwreck, but he survived. He was the man who got thrown in the hospital and forgotten about. And it was this woman who was making the journey to his aunt's house to tell her that he was still alive. And it was only because Mary had that totally bizarre nightmare that sort of led her to that shed that she found this woman who would have died in that shed and never quite gotten to the aunt's house, and so never could have told the family, never could have told Mary that her husband's still alive. It was because of that dream that fate aligned, and now her husband was back. Mary and her husband's story wound up being published in newspapers all over the world. I mean, people really could not get enough of this story. But despite how far-reaching this story became, nobody was ever able to come up with a logical explanation for how so many coincidences and this crazy dream Mary had, how it all came together to reunite Mary and her husband. At 6:30 p.m. on July 29th, 2023, a 15-year-old girl named Talia Davila Diaz stood right outside her back door of her house, staring out at the thick, dense, shadowy rainforest that was her backyard. Talia lived in a tiny, isolated village in Peru that was literally in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. So as she was looking out, she would have seen these huge tropical trees and heard the sound of howler monkeys and exotic birds and animals moving all about, and the air would have been really thick and humid. But she wasn't thinking about any of that. Instead, she was focused on this grapefruit tree that was only a few yards away from her house. She wanted to go get a grapefruit and bring it inside and make juice for her family. However, Talia was scared. And she was scared for two reasons. The first reason was this was the Amazon, an inherently dangerous place, especially at night. There were loads of predators out there, like snakes and jaguars. But the other reason she was scared was that she was worried there could actually be something worse out in the rainforest, worse than any predators she was used to. And that was because over the last couple of weeks, people in Talia's village had been claiming they were seeing these shadowy figures lurking in the tree line with these bright green eyes that would occasionally seem like they were hunting the people of the village. Like anytime they went out, it was like these figures were kind of lurking off in the distance, but nobody knew what they were. The rumor around the village was that these shadowy figures were actually pelikaras, which translates literally to face peelers. People in Talia's village believed that palacaras were foreigners who would kidnap locals and cut their throats and peel the skin of their face off and then sell their body fat on the black market. And the locals were so freaked out that palacaras could be around that they began performing nightly patrols to keep the villagers safe. So Talia, again, was very scared to even leave her house at this point. But she was also trying to be reasonable. I mean, she'd gone out and gotten a grapefruit many times in the past. This was not some new behavior, so she's looking out and she sees the grapefruit tree and she knows there's a nightly patrol out right now, and I only have to go a few yards and get the fruit and get right back in the house. Like, how big of a deal could this possibly be? And so after taking one more look around and not seeing anybody or hearing anything that was out of place, she took a breath and then rushed out to the tree. She grabbed a grapefruit, and as she was turning around, she froze because her worst nightmare had just been realized. Now, standing between her and her back door were these two hulking dark figures. And one of them was like so tall, it was practically the size of a tree. And they both had these piercing, glowing green eyes. And they were looking right at Talia. And Talia was so instantaneously petrified that all she could do was just stand there and stare back into their green eyes. And as she did, she began to notice that their faces were grotesquely elongated, almost like they had masks on. And then before Talia could do anything, the really tall one began sort of gliding towards her. Not stepping towards her, but literally almost hovering off the ground towards Talia. And then suddenly, Talia was being grabbed and thrown to the ground. And the instant Talia hit the ground, these two figures descended on her and pinned her there. And then one of them reached down and pressed their hand over her mouth and her nose, and she couldn't breathe. And then she sees the other one is holding what looked like a box cutter or a knife, and they put it right up to her neck. And suddenly it's like Talia understands these are palacaras. They're gonna slit her throat. They're gonna kill her. And so she has this sudden burst of energy and she manages to push them off of her. And when she did, their hand came off her mouth and she screamed out for help. And she heard somewhere in the village voices yelling back to her, and then she heard footsteps, and she knew it was the night patrol coming to save her. And so at this point, the figures released Talia, and she scrambled to her feet and immediately ran towards her house right as the night patrol came bounding into her yard, and one of the men had a gun, and he raised it and began shooting in the direction of the figures. And Talia, she's totally panicked, and she turns around, and she looks at her attackers, and she's expecting them to, be fleeing into the rainforest. But instead, these dark figures, they were like levitating in the sky, and they were looking down at Talia and the night patrol with their glowing green eyes as they literally began to levitate into the sky. And the whole time, the night patrol is firing repeatedly at these things, and they just drifted off into the night and disappeared. Talia ultimately would not suffer any physical injuries from this encounter, but mentally, she was a wreck. And frankly, so was the rest of the people in her village, especially those who were on the night patrol and with Talia witnessed these figures with green eyes flying away into the sky. I mean, the fear in this village following this encounter was through the roof. And in fact, ultimately, the Peruvian government would get involved after this encounter, and they would investigate to try to figure out, what happened to Talia. And they would ultimately conclude that there was an illegal mining operation happening somewhere in the rainforest, and some of these miners, in an effort to scare people away from coming anywhere near their operation, they got their hands on jetpacks, wore armor and masks, and then went into villages like Talia's and basically pretended to be aliens and then did, fly off on their jetpacks. That is the official story as of right now. However, people like Talia and the other people in her village and many other people who live in the Amazon rainforest who have come in contact with these figures with green eyes, they say those are no miners. Those are either palacaras or they are creatures from another world. On the afternoon of May 21st, 1974, a 39-year-old man named Pilar Gomez walked through a forest in Argentina. In his hand was a machete and an axe. And as he walked, he used the machete to clear brush, and then eventually he reached this huge tree, and he put the machete down, gripped his axe, and got ready to chop it down. However, before Pilar took his first swing, he looked up and he noticed pretty high up on this tree were these very deep claw marks right into the bark of the tree. Now, at first he thought, oh, that's gotta be, a bear's claw marks. But the more he looked at it, the more he realized that would have been an enormous bear to leave marks like those. I mean, these are deep and wide claw marks. Now, Pilar was a professional lumberjack, and he actually lived in this section of forest. He owned this plot of the forest. His cabin was only a few yards away, and he was used to coming in contact with the wildlife, like bears. Now, his friends and family thought he was crazy for living out here. I mean, his neighbors were miles away, he didn't have a phone or a car, he lived totally alone. And so, in virtue of living in this isolated forest, Pilar routinely came across animals that lived out here, like bears. And it didn't really frighten him. He sort of understood that's part of living out here. But he knew his friends and family thought he was totally crazy for living out here. And not just because it was so isolated, not just because he didn't have a car or a phone and was totally alone basically 24/7, but because, according to local legend, this particular forest was effectively haunted. There were these apparent unnatural huge creatures that roamed this forest and would prey on people like Pilar. But Pilar didn't believe in any of that nonsense. He knew that, as he looked at these claw marks, this has to be a bear. This is not some huge unnatural creature that's completely made up. And so Pilar just went ahead and began cutting this tree down. And right as this tree smashed into the ground, making a thundering boom, at the exact same moment, basically right behind Pilar, he heard this horrible growling noise, like a huge animal was basically coming up right behind him. And so Pilar, he whipped around and looked, but there was nothing there. It was just a wide open forest. Everywhere he looked, it was just trees, nothing else. And so Pilar began to think to himself, did I even hear that? I mean, could I really have just been hearing the sound of the tree hitting the ground that somehow also sounded like a growl behind me? Like, am I, psyching myself out here? Am I creating stories in my head because I'm thinking about those claw marks? And he was like, you know what? It's all gonna be in my head. I didn't hear anything. I'm all alone out here. I'm safe. I'm good. And so Pilar just got back to work processing this tree. For the next couple of hours, he didn't see or hear anything strange. He just continued to chop this tree into smaller pieces, and then he would carry those pieces right over to his cabin, which again was not far away, and he stacked up this huge pile of lumber right beside the side of his cabin. And then finally, when the tree was all processed and Pilar was back in his cabin, he realized he was pretty hungry. At this point, it was getting dark outside and it was time for dinner. Typically, Pilar would eat his dinner outside. He enjoyed listening to the crickets and just feeling the warm night air, and tonight was no exception. So he grabbed some stew from the night before, he went outside, and outside he had this table that was right next to his cabin, and then just beyond the table, farther away from the cabin, was this wood stove. And so he got the wood stove going, and then he put his stew on the stove to warm up, and then he sat down at the table, and he just sat there, enjoying the night, waiting for his food to be done. And as Pilar just sat there relaxing, he suddenly realized that he couldn't hear any crickets. They had gone completely silent. And then as he looked around at the dark forest, he realized the forest was actually silent. I mean, there was no noise whatsoever. The only noise was his stove. And Pilar knew that the only time the forest got this way was if there was some big predator around. And so right away, Pilar thought back to the claw marks in the tree and, that growling sound that he wasn't sure if he heard or not. And he's thinking, maybe the bear is back. And so Pilar scanned the tree line, trying to see movement. But there was nothing. It was just deadly silent and just a dark forest in all directions. And so feeling really unsettled, Pilar decided he should just go back inside his cabin and eat in there where it was more safe. And so Pilar stood up and he walked towards his cabin and he was about to go inside when he remembered he had left the stove on with the stew on top warming up. And so he turned back around and he looked out at the dark forest and it's still totally silent. He can't see any movement. And as quick as he could, he walked past the table, out to the stove, he shut the vents in the stove, and he was about to grab the stew to go back inside with it, when something really powerful struck him in the back, knocking the wind out of him, and then before he could react, he looked down and he saw this massive furry arm with sharp claws reaching around him, pulling at his midsection. It was the bear. And so immediately Pilar began thrashing, trying to get away, and he managed to kind of stumble forward, and his machete was on the ground near the stove. And he fumbles down, he grabs the machete, and he wheels around to strike this bear to get rid of it. But the second he saw the bear, he realized it wasn't a bear. And instinctively he knew he just had to run.
And so he turned and began sprinting towards that lumber pile he had cut up before right next to his cabin. And as he was scrambling up this pile, he could hear the sound of this thing running towards him. And then he felt another explosion on the side of his head. And even though he now has been wounded, probably gravely, it was like all adrenaline. And he kept going up the lumber pile and he clambered onto the roof of his cabin. Then he turned around, getting ready to fight as best as he could, whatever this thing was. But when he looked out, this thing was just gone. The forest was deadly silent again and there was nothing out there. And so as he's sitting there kind of looking around, waiting for this thing to pop back up again, he reached up and he felt the side of his head and his ear was missing. This thing had ripped his ear off when it hit him in the side of the head. Pilar would remain on the roof of his cabin all night, just constantly scanning, looking for this bear creature to return. But it didn't. The forest just remained totally silent and nothing happened all night. And then finally in the morning when the sun began to come up, the forest kind of went back to normal. And at that point, Pilar is kind of delirious from blood loss and the impact to his head. And he knew he just had to get out of here and go get help. And so he climbed off the roof and then he ran about a mile to the nearest building, which was this woodworking shop. And when he got there, there were a couple of people there. And when they saw the state Pilar was in, they didn't need to be told that he needed to go to the hospital. They just instinctively put him in the car and drove him there. After Pilar was stabilized and his wound was treated and he was sort of in recovery at the hospital, the police showed up to interview him to see what happened. And Pilar would tell them the story about how, the day before he had seen those claw marks in the tree and then he had heard that loud growling sound behind him, or so he thought. And then that night, this bear had attacked him at his cabin. And he said at some point he had broken away and grabbed the machete and he turned to defend himself and he got a good look at this bear. And it was at least 6 feet tall, it was covered in black hair, had sharp claws. I mean, it was every bit a bear, except its face. It wasn't a bear's face. It was a human face. Now, to this point, as Pilar was telling his story, one of the police officers was taking notes. Everything Pilar said, he was writing it down. But when Pilar began talking about the bear with the human face, the officer just stopped taking notes, and the officer said, that can't be true. There aren't any bears with human faces. But Pilar, he's like a rugged lumberjack who lives in the forest by himself. And he's telling these officers, I know how crazy this sounds. I know it's not realistic, but I'm telling you what I saw is this bear with a human face. That's what I saw. But the officer just 100% did not believe him. And ultimately, this went down as simply a bear attack, and that was it. The case was closed. However, despite what the police said, since the attack on Pilar, there have been at least 30 people who have come forward to say they either saw firsthand or were attacked by this bear-like creature with a human face in that forest in Argentina. Sightings are so common that locals even came up with a name for this creature. They call it the Ucumar. And to this day, nobody has any idea who or what it is.
Somewhere out in the Sierra Nevada mountain range lies a small hunting camp that's been there since the 1950s. Despite its fame, only a handful of people know exactly where this camp is. But even if you were given explicit directions on how to get there, you might just walk past it because it's tucked away in the middle of the woods up on this mountain. It's just a small fire pit, a couple of logs around it, another log set up for cutting wood, and there's some paths that have been beaten down over the years from its occupants, but it's pretty much unremarkable. According to camp members, the fastest way to get to the site is by horseback, and it's approximately 8 miles, and it's through very rugged terrain on this mountain, and it includes a 4,000-foot elevation gain. However, this 8-mile trail is not marked, and every year it changes slightly because trees will fall along the way, changing the topography. Ron Moorhead, who's one of the 4 original camp members, laments the fact that anybody knows anything about this campsite. He wishes they could have kept it a secret. But he knew that wasn't an option after what they discovered there in late 1971. In early 1971, Ron was a young man and he was invited out for the first time to the Sierra camp by the 3 founding members. When Ron got there, he fell in love. It was this beautiful, natural, pristine wilderness that overlooked this amazing valley, and they're surrounded by these huge white fir trees. There's a freshwater stream that trickled by, and in terms of hunting, the deer were plentiful. Ron said this campsite was the closest to heaven he thinks he'll ever get. The only real drawback of the site was the large bear population, but they always had guns on them, and they built this shelter out of heavy fallen timbers that they could go inside, shut the door, and they'd be protected from the bears until they left. When there wasn't a bear threat, they slept on the ground in tents. In late 1971, Ron came back to the camp with the other 3 founding members. They'd had a great day of hunting, and they were standing around the campfire just chatting with each other when they started hearing a grunting sound not far away from them in the forest. Now, typically, whenever a bear came to their campsite, it was usually at night, and they would hear it grunting somewhere off in the forest, and as soon as they heard it, they would stop and they would listen to kind of confirm it was a bear, and if it was, they would go inside of their shelter and they would wait for it to leave. But this time, when they stopped to listen to confirm it was a bear, the sound they heard next was something they had never heard before, and it was so frightening they almost fell over each other running to get inside of the shelter. It was like a whooping sound you would expect from an ape, except instead of a series of whoops like you would expect from an ape, it was one loud whoop, and then silence, and then another creature somewhere else made a responding whoop that sounded different than the first. There was at least 2 creatures that were basically speaking to each other out in the forest out of view. Ron would say, as these creatures were howling and whooping at each other out in the forest, the men were huddled around inside of the shelter looking at each other like, what is that? Has anybody heard that sound before? And nobody knew what it was. And after a little while, they heard these creatures running towards the camp. They were pretty well off, but they heard these heavy footsteps approaching. And so Ron and the others, they put themselves up against these slats inside of the shelter where they could look out in the direction where these creatures were. And they're staring out just past the light of their campfire into the dark forest. And they hear these things running, and they stop. They don't come into the clearing. It's like they're just outside of where they could see. And then their tone completely changes. These creatures, which are now one on one side of the camp and one on the other, begin speaking to each other in a language that almost sounds human, but it was nonsensical. It sounded like an imitation of a human language, but not human. And so Ron and the others are terrified, and they're just staring through the slats, waiting to see this creature that's going to emerge at some point, but it never does. Instead, the creatures continue to stay outside of the light, and they move around behind their shelter out of view. And so Ron and the others move to the very middle of their shelter to get as far away from the walls as they can, because there are breaks in the walls, and they're worried one of these things is going to reach through and grab them. But finally, after hours of these creatures running around the perimeter of their camp, communicating in this totally otherworldly language, they started whooping again and ran off. And for the rest of the night, Ron and the other 3 stayed right in that shelter. The next day, when the sun came up, the men were out of that camp as fast as they could. These are hard, rugged men, and they were very shaken up by this experience. And they tried to talk about it, but there was just no way to describe what they were hearing and experiencing. And so they just decided they just wanted to get out of there as fast as possible, and they'll deal with this later. But as soon as they got out of the woods and back to their homes, they didn't talk about it anymore, except Ron became obsessed with whatever it was that was making that sound. He so desperately wanted to find out what it was. And so he convinced the other 3 members to come with him and go back to the campsite, except this time Ron was going to bring an audio recorder, and he was going to try to capture some audio of these creatures. And so the 4 men went back to the campsite. They didn't even hunt that day. They stayed right near the campsite. They made this big fire, and they're all just kind of nervously sitting there waiting, kind of hoping it happens and also hoping it doesn't happen. And at some point in the evening, Ron said he heard footsteps way out in the middle of the forest, and they sounded like they were running towards the camp. The 4 men sprint inside the shelter, lock it behind them, and Ron turns on the audio recorder. Now, before you listen to this famous recording, here are its bona fides. After being recorded, Ron sent it to Dr. R. Lynn Curlin, who is a professor of electrical engineering at the University of Wyoming, and he and his team analyzed it, and they concluded that 1, it was unaltered, so it's not been edited, it's not been doctored in any way, it's an authentic audio recording. And 2, whatever was making the sounds could not have been a man, because their vocal range was dramatically higher and lower than that of a human's. The doctor said, based on average pitch and tract length, the creature that was making the sound most likely was between 7'3" and 8 feet tall. In addition to the Dr. Curlin examination, a cryptolinguist expert named Scott Nelson also pointed out that it would have been nearly impossible in 1971 for Ron or any of the other hunters to dub the sound of their voices, which are on the recording, over the sounds that these creatures were making. Because a couple times in the recording, you hear both sets of voices happening at once. That's something you couldn't have done in 1971. Despite numerous attempts to debunk this recording, it still stands as a legitimate, unedited recording. Although what they were recording is still a mystery. Have a listen.
There's two of them across the creek at the big rocks. It's a hard act to follow.
It sounds like he talks to us and they talk to each other.
Yeah. Right there, I just seen movement right through there.
Shortly after this recording was made, Ron stopped hunting at this camp. However, over the years, he has gone back several times because he's obsessed with trying to find out what's out in the forest, but he says to this day, he still has no idea. On the afternoon of Sunday, February 25th, 1855, a 48-year-old woman named Hannah Rallinson, along with her husband and a group of her friends, walked quickly down a road in Sheffield, England. As they walked, the entire group was totally silent because they were terrified of what was going to happen next. Behind Hannah and her friends on this road was actually another slightly larger group of people that were keeping pace with Hannah and her friends. They were actually going to the same place as them, except this second group had no intention of going inside that building. They were just there to see what happened. Now, Hannah and her friends were totally offended and annoyed by this group that was following them, but they knew there was nothing they could do, and so they just kept on walking in silence. And as Hannah walked in silence, she couldn't help but think to herself, how in the world did I get into this position? At the time, Sheffield, England was a big industrial city with lots of metalworking factories all over the place. And so loads of people at the time were coming to Sheffield to work in those factories. And as the population increased in Sheffield, the city began building all these tenement apartments, which are kind of like these low quality, cramped, interconnected apartments that are basically cheap and easy to make and house lots and lots of people. Hannah and her husband lived in one of these tenement apartments, and they worked in one of the metalworking factories, which meant their lives were pretty rough and difficult. But recently, their lives had become even more challenging when their oldest son had died in a coal mining accident. And this totally devastated the parents, but Hannah definitely took it the worst. In her grief, Hannah became very antisocial and began just going to the factory and doing backbreaking labor all day, and then came straight home. She would go to a room by herself, and she would just sit there all night and pray and try to communicate with her dead son. Now, at first, Hannah's husband basically did the same thing as Hannah. He put all of his energy and his time and his focus on work, even though it was totally backbreaking and miserable, mainly because it was a distraction from this terrible grief he was dealing with. But after several weeks and months went by, Hannah's husband did begin to kind of get back to normal and began to move forward with his life. But he could see Hannah was not doing that. Hannah was totally depressed and isolated, and so he eventually encouraged her to start going back to church and start spending more time with people there, make some new friends, and hopefully being around some people will help you cope with this tragedy. And Hannah had actually taken her husband's advice. She began going back to church, she made a bunch of new friends, she rekindled old relationships, and before long, she was getting that support, and it was helping her kind of move through this grieving process. But ironically, it was this new church support group that had thrust Hannah into a new horrible situation, one that was playing out on the streets of Sheffield, England, as Hannah, her husband, and her church friends speed walked down the road with this big group following behind them. And so in this group of people with Hannah was obviously her husband, as well as her closest friend from church, whose name was Harriet Ward. And then also there was 3 members of the Favell family. There was Mr. and Mrs. Favell, as well as Mrs. Favell's sister. And all of them were headed to the tenement apartment on Campo Lane, where Harriet Ward and the Favell family lived together. Hannah and her group, and the second group that was following them, all came from the same place. They all went to the same church, and that day, for the previous 2 hours before they all took to the streets here, they had been having this really heated argument about what to do about Harriet and the Favell family's basement. Or, more specifically, what to do about what was in their basement. Some parishioners said that Harriet and the Favell family were just totally making up what was going on in their basement. But other parishioners believed them and said that that basement was so dangerous, nobody should go in it. In fact, we should just board up that basement permanently, or we should just level the entire tenement apartment building. And when that idea began gaining some traction, that lots of people in the church began saying, yeah, let's block off the basement or knock the apartment down, the Favell family and Harriet, who lived in this apartment building and did not want to, permanently block off segments of it or knock it down, they got so angry that they just stood up and left. And at this point, Hannah and her husband just got up and left with their friends. Now, once they got outside, they didn't really have a plan, but they felt strongly that they just needed to get to the Campo Lane tenement apartment building and at a minimum, just be in there to prevent other people from showing up and doing something to the apartment, like trying to knock it down or do something to the basement. And so Hannah and her group began speed walking to the apartment, and this gaggle of other churchgoers who were part of this argument just kind of naturally came outside and followed them. And then when Hannah and her friends reached the apartment building on Campo Lane, they went inside and shut and locked the door behind them. And for a moment, Hannah and the 5 other people she was with, they just stood there in silence, not really sure what to do next. But eventually, one of them said, "We gotta do something about the basement, because if we don't, the people outside will." Hannah walked over to the front of the apartment where there was a big window that looked out to the street. And when she looked out there, she saw the big group of people that had followed them were all kind of gathering around the small window that looked down into the Campo Lane tenement apartment basement. It was like all these people were jockeying for position to get the best look. Hannah shut the blind in frustration and then walked back over to the group. And then after a few minutes, Mr. Favell said, guys, it's only going to be daylight for a few more hours. If we're going to do something in the basement, we have to get down there before the daylight is gone. We can't be down there in the dark. The group nodded because they understood why. They definitely did not want to be down there in the dark. And then Mr. Favell looked over at Hannah's husband and he kind of gestured like, why don't we, the 2 of us, go down there together? And Hannah's husband, even though he did not want to go down there, he just nodded and said, okay, let's go. Moments later, Hannah, Harriet, and the 2 Favell women watched as the 2 men opened up the basement door, turned around and looked at the women, and then they slowly began descending the stairs. And then after a couple of minutes, the only sound coming out of the basement was the sound of these 2 men using big metal tools to attempt to break up the stone floor in the basement. For the next 2 hours, Mr. Favell and Hannah's husband continued to smash up the floor in the basement, but every time they removed a big piece of stone, all they'd find was dirt underneath. There was nothing else. Meanwhile, outside, the crowd looking in that window into the basement was only getting bigger and bigger. It was no longer just other members of their church. It was now just random people who saw this big group and walked over to see what was going on. And Hannah, who was at that window looking out into the street, she was seeing this group growing and seeing how rowdy they were getting, and it was starting to make her really nervous. But the nerves she felt about the crowd were nothing compared to the nerves she felt about her husband and Mr. Favell still being in that basement now that the sun was about to set. She did not want them down there in the dark. And finally, when the sun did set and the 2 men still had not come up, Hannah just rushed over to the basement and yelled for them to stop what they were doing and get up here. And the 2 men did as she asked. They dropped their tools and came upstairs looking totally dejected. They had not found the thing they were looking for down there, which meant they had failed. But Hannah and her friends were hoping that now that it was dark outside and the people outside could no longer actually see into the basement because it was too dark, that maybe the crowd would disperse. But as Hannah, her husband, Harriet, and the Favells sat down to have some dinner in the apartment, they looked outside periodically and they saw the crowd was not going away. If anything, the crowd was still continuing to get bigger. Now, you got to remember, this is Sheffield, England in the 1800s. This was a tough place to live. Everybody's working at these factories, doing this awful work 7 days a week for very little money, and there's virtually no entertainment anywhere. It's basically just work, work, work until you die. And so when people in Sheffield saw this big group of people at night standing around this apartment window, it was exciting, and that was pretty rare in their lives, and so they were not about to leave and go home because their lives at home were terrible. And so, by about midnight, there was this huge crowd right outside of the Campo Lane apartment, and it meant that, Hannah and her husband really couldn't leave to go back to their apartment. They were kind of trapped because of this crowd. Also, the crowd was really starting to get rowdy, and the Favell family were starting to get worried that a fight would break out near the basement window, and then maybe the window would break, and then these people would storm into their apartment and maybe rob them. I mean, they didn't know. And so Mrs. Favell came up with this plan to try to get the crowd to leave them alone. And so she ran over to one of the biggest windows on the first floor, and she pulled down the curtain rod and the curtain attached to it, and she handed it to her sister and said, "Go down in the basement and use this curtain rod and curtain to block out the one window this crowd has to look into the basement. If they can't see into the basement, then they'll likely just leave." But Mrs. Favell's sister, after being handed this curtain rod, she's like, "I don't want to go in the basement. It's the middle of the night. I'm not going down there." And over the next couple of minutes, the entire group just kind of bickered about who should be the one to go down into the basement to cover up this window. And nobody wanted to do it. And finally, Hannah, who she's lost her son recently, she just wants to go home at this point, but she can't because of this stupid group. She finally just snaps and says, "You know what? I'll do it." And so she snatches the curtain rod and just walks right over to the basement door. She opens it up and begins descending the stairs before anybody else could stop her. And as she did, her husband and Harriet and the Favell family, they all crowded around the top of the basement stairs, looking down, kind of waiting to see what would happen. And so they all heard as Hannah turned the corner and walked over to that window, and they could hear her kind of messing around with the curtain as she put it in place. And then even though they could not see her down there, because the basement's totally dark, they can't see the window, they heard Hannah call out that she was done. She had put the curtain up, it's blocked, and now she was going to come back upstairs. But after she yelled to them that she was coming back up, it went completely silent in the basement. And for like 5, 6, 7 seconds, all the people at the top of the stairs are waiting anxiously for Hannah to turn the corner and come up the stairs to safety. But then this tense silence was broken with a horrible scream coming out of the basement. It was Hannah, and then silence again. And at this point, Hannah's husband, he's like, "Oh my God, something's happened." And he charges down the stairs and he looks over and he sees Hannah is lying on the ground motionless. There's nothing else in the basement. It's just his wife and this covered up window. And so he runs over, he scoops her up and he runs her back upstairs and he lays her on the ground right outside of the basement door. And then he began to shake her to try to wake her up, but she wasn't waking up. However, it was clear she was still breathing, and so Harriet ran and got a wet towel, and she came back and she kneeled down next to Hannah, and she placed the towel on Hannah's forehead, hoping this wet towel would revive Hannah. But as Harriet is kneeling there, so she's looking at Hannah's body, and the basement door, which is open, is right past Hannah's body, Harriet happened to look up, and so now she's looking into the doorway that leads down into the basement, and her eyes went wide, and she screamed, and then she passed out. The big controversy over this basement began several weeks earlier at the beginning of February when Harriet and the Favell family began hearing all these strange sounds coming out of the basement. Now, initially, they had totally written off these sounds as being, strange creaking and cracking sounds that were just the product of a poorly constructed building with lots of people inside of it. But the noises they were hearing from the basement only got louder and louder and more intense, and they were especially bad at night. And so basically, Harriet and the Favell family were so scared to go down there that they just stopped, especially at night. Sometimes they'd go during the day, but at night it was like, no one's going down there. We don't know what's going on, but I'm not going down there. And then on February 24th, so this is one day before all this craziness happened where, Hannah and her friends get followed to the apartment, and then Hannah goes down and she passes out, and then Harriet passes out. So one day before that, Harriet swore she saw a ghost in the basement. She saw this old woman wearing a white gown kind of moving around in the basement, and the whole time Harriet said this woman, this ghost woman, was pointing at one particular spot on the ground in the basement. And then the same night that Harriet sees this ghost in the basement, Harriet has a dream. And in her dream, she sees this ghost. And again, this ghost is in that basement and it's pointing at the spot on the basement floor. Except in Harriet's dream, this ghost woman speaks to Harriet and says that she was murdered and her gold was stolen from her and buried in the basement right there. And it was this apparent ghost in the Campo Lane basement that was the center of that 2-hour-long argument at the church the following day, which ultimately prompted Hannah, her husband, Harriet, the Favell family, to get up and storm out to go protect the Campo Lane apartment, and then also the secondary group followed right after them, really just to see if they were going to go confront the ghost, because a lot of people thought that's what they're going to go do. And that is basically what Hannah, her husband, and her friends ended up doing. They decided the two men would go down into the basement and attempt to dig up the floor in hopes that they might find this gold that was stolen from this murdered woman and buried in the basement. But they obviously did not find the gold, which ultimately led to Hannah going down and passing out, and then Harriet also passing out. Hannah and Harriet would wake up after passing out. And when they woke up, they would tell these terrifying stories about what they saw. Hannah said she went down the stairs, she went over to the window where all the crowd was looking in, and she managed to get this curtain up, and then she yelled upstairs to her husband and her friends that she was coming back up. But when Hannah actually turned around to go to the stairs, she realized the ghost was in the basement with her. There was this old woman wearing a white gown standing between Hannah and the stairs. She was blocking her way. And this woman was staring at Hannah really intently. And then Hannah screamed, and this ghost charged at Hannah and basically went through her body. And it was at that point that Hannah passed out onto the ground. As for Harriet, when she came to, her story was even more terrifying. Harriet said after she placed that wet towel on Hannah's head, she looked up and she saw the woman in white walking up the stairs, staring directly at Harriet. And Harriet, she froze and kind of leaned back and just stared at this woman. And the woman, she came right to the top of the stairs. She stopped in the doorway, and then she opened up her mouth grotesquely wide and just continued to stare directly at Harriet. And then with slow, trembling hands, the woman began taking off her nightgown, which eventually fell to the ground. And Harriet saw this woman was covered in cuts and gashes all over her chest and neck. And then Harriet let out a scream, and she passed out too. Not long after Hannah and Harriet both came to and told their horrible stories, the police arrived outside and dispersed the big crowd, which meant Hannah and her husband could finally leave and go back to their own apartment, and they would. But just 12 hours later, Hannah would die. The Sheffield coroner held an inquest into Hannah's death, but he could find no scientific explanation for why Hannah actually died. And so on her death certificate, it basically says she died of fright. She was literally scared to death. Following Hannah's very bizarre and basically unexplained death, Harriet, who would survive, and the Favell family, they just moved out. They could not stand to be at that apartment any longer. And then also many more people who lived inside of this tenement apartment building on Campbell Lane, they also moved out because, again, it was just too terrifying to be near this basement. To this day, we still don't have a better explanation for what happened to Hannah. She was in good health, all things considered, when she died. And so really this didn't make any sense. And so this case still is one of the only in recorded history where somebody apparently died just from getting scared.